director of Forward Thinking, long-time seasoned mediator. Forward Thinking is a charity, an organisation which looks to bring conflict resolution to the Middle East. Great to have you back with us, Oliver. Let's begin on your thoughts on the significance of this moment. These talks, they may be for one day, we don't know, but how would you surmise its significance?
Well, the fact that they met face to face, I think, is a significant breakthrough, and it does give hope. Also, I think the fact that experts have been included in part of the talks is also very important. But I think we shouldn't put too much hope in, because we've seen before these signs where there could be a breakthrough, you could have a permanent ceasefire, you could move forward to a more durable agreement. And then twice we've seen the Iranians being disappointed by attacks in June and again at the end of February. So I think despite all the good signs, we've got to keep in mind at the moment, from the Iranian perspective, there would be zero trust.
I think I'm right in saying, Oliver, you have, through direct or unofficial back-channel talks, that you have talked with Iranian negotiators in the past. And I would like, if that's the case, you to give us an idea of the type of negotiators they are.
Well, for 10 years, we moderated a group in Helsinki, sponsored by the Finnish government, where we brought together particularly the Iranians and Saudi Arabians, but also other countries from the region, Turkey, Iraq, were also represented, and some European countries. Now, I always found in that time the Iranian negotiators, and they were high-level officials, I always found them really reliable. You could trust what they were saying. Okay, they had difficulties. They had to uphold, if you like, the official policy. But this was regarded as an unofficial space, so officials could talk more freely. And it encouraged me. I could not understand why Iran hasn't been brought in out of the cold for a very long time.
I'd like your thoughts on, if you were in the room, if you were at the Serena Hotel today, what would you be thinking in that mindset of negotiating, mediating, given what's going on, given how wide apart these two sides are in terms of maximalist stance? Talk me through your methodology.
Well, first of all, I'd be very anxious about the running commentary that is going on. I think for talks to be successful, you do need them to take place in privacy and confidentiality. I think that gives time to people to really think through. The other aspect would be to make sure that people are, in fact, not just listening, but understanding the other perspective. Because basically, what we very often face is a clash of perspectives. People see the same object, the same truth, but in a different way because of where they are coming from. And I think you have to invest time. I remember when we had the former foreign minister, Sharif, present, and he was giving quite a long explanation. A former Egyptian foreign minister went over and he said, you've got to keep in mind that Iranians are carpet weavers. You have to wait to see the end product before you fully understand where they're moving to. Now, I was sharing that about 2 weeks ago with a meeting in Istanbul, and one of the American ambassadors says that we are hamburger makers. In other words, we rush things. It doesn't take much effort, and the end product comes out. And I think that picture gives us the challenge that any mediator will have to deal with to move forward to a durable agreement.
I'm struck on two things that I'd like your comparison of. If we look back to the talks that led to the Iranian restrictions on its nuclear ambitions, the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, as it was called, this was years of negotiations. There were two key figures at the time. One of them was for the Iranians, Mohammad Javad Zarif, who was US educated, foreign minister at the time, and John Kerry for the US. Now, these two men reportedly got on famously in the room. There was a strong rapport and was credited to some degree with providing momentum to bring this along. And I'd like you to compare this right now to this moment that we've got with two different protagonists in the room, J.D. Vance on one side and Mohammed Ghalibaf on the other. Tell me your thoughts there.
A difficult question, but it would be hard not to get on with Foreign Minister Zarif, because I met him on several occasions, and he has that ability to engage you in a way that I can see why Kerry and himself got on. I think what they have to allow this time is the first meeting between the current foreign minister, who is also a very pleasant man, easy to get on with. And I don't know Vance, but some of his statements, I found them rather abrupt. Hopefully, given time, given space, allowing them to meet, look at each other in the eyes, where I hope that there will be some rapport, because that is essential. Without that human factor coming in and rapport, it's very, very difficult to move on to areas of agreement.
I'm struck by one motivational factor here, and one is kind of the rhetoric of President Trump, and there are echoes with President Obama within it, and perhaps not just coincidence. So when we look at the Iran war, we look at the rescue operation just a few days ago, the three words he used to communicate: we got him. This is exactly the same terminology President Obama used 14 years ago of Osama bin Laden, these big momentous moments. He also talked with Iran about specifically extending a hand. Well, rewind to the JCPOA. President Obama said, extend a hand if you open your fist. There is some within the administration, some sources suggesting that the achievement for President Trump would be to say to his audience before the midterm elections that he achieved something more than President Obama could do. Now, if that's the case, and given you've been in some of these rooms, how do you work around that, Oliver?
Rather difficult. Again, I think what we've got to keep in mind this time is that when Zarif, in 2015, the negotiators knew that they had support behind them. They knew there was a desire to move on. Iran needed sanctions lifting. I think they also knew that they accepted the fatwa that Khomeini had issued forbidding the development of nuclear weapons. There were certain things accepted. Now, I think the current negotiators have a difficulty because they have two very strong characters whose interests may well clash, and that may be the threat to any agreement or ceasefire that comes out of this current meeting. And first of all, Trump, as you mentioned, is facing the November elections. So it's in his interest, I would think, to find some solution. But Netanyahu is also facing elections, if not in July, certainly in October. And in my opinion, it's in his interest to see the continuation of this war, because as long as the war continues, he has a better chance, I think, of being re-elected. Now, that, I think, is the backdrop that really creates a very, very challenging situation for the Pakistanis and their efforts to mediate.
In the balance of power going into these negotiations, who do you think has the upper hand right now?
Well, I was very critical of the Iranians when they started the bombardment of American bases in the neighboring countries, because I thought they needed the support of the bases. But if you see it as a tactic, it has probably been the closing of the Strait and the impact that it has had on the global economy is probably been their best weapon, and one that they have used quite effectively. Now, in saying that, I don't endorse it, but that does give them an important card in this current. But Gareth, what really worries me, if you saw the insider's account of what led to the war from the American perspective, that was published in the New York Times. Nowhere in that account was either the legal or the moral norms discussed. So what worries me is we're trying to reach an agreement, but the legal and moral norms are not the framework, you might say, in which agreement can be framed. Now, that is deeply worrying. And I think if these talks don't move on to that and bring back into play the rule-based order that arose from the horrors of the Second World War, and then also the moral code that has been a guide to just war for a long period, if those are not brought into play again, I think as globally, we're heading into a very, very dark place in our human history.
Can I ask you then, an influence, to the extent of the influence of moral voices, and your thoughts many moons ago, a former Catholic priest, when we look at the Pope at the moment, Pope Leo, talking about don't evoke God to bless any war, tacit, pointed messages towards Pete Hegseth in particular, praying and using the moment to kind of go forth his soldiers, and also to President Trump as well, saying it was absolutely outrageous that he would have a civilizational threat in words to Iran. Whether you think there is an influence from this Pope, is he a factor?
Well, sadly, I think his pronouncements haven't been given that much attention by the media, the global media. And I don't know what impact it will have in America. But we saw again the chaplain or the archbishop, who was the head of the chaplains to the American Armed Forces. And I think there's over 1 million Catholics in the forces. He warned them that, in fact, this wasn't a just war. And that must have put, I would say, a number of serving people in the American Armed Forces in a difficult situation where conscience has to come into play. And I don't think it is allowed in America. I don't know whether you can have selective conscientious objection, that if you have a moral objection to what's going on, whether you can actually withdraw yourself from action. We have to go back to Nuremberg and remember the key finding in Nuremberg, that following orders is no justification for war crimes. You cannot get away from that. So I think legally and morally, it's good to hear the Pope remind us, as I say, of the framework we should be working within and the need to curtail the language. The root of the problem, Gavin, I think, is that Trump and Netanyahu are very much followers of the doctrine, peace, in their words, peace through strength. In other words, to have security, you have to have total domination around your neighborhood. Now, history shows us that doctrine is unsustainable. You could go right back to the time of Alexander the Great, when he in fact, in his crusade against the Persians, spent 3.5 years in Gaza and realized he couldn't keep it and had to give up that. I think peace, and what the Pope is articulating, peace only comes through justice, and that in practical terms, you have to recognize the equality of the other and also give them the space to be. Now, any, I'd say, agreement that is reached on these talks must come into that framework and not the peace through strength.
Always good to talk to you. We had a few technical problems, Oliver, but it's worth hearing a voice of experience in these times. Oliver McTernan, thank you. A veteran conflict mediator and director of Forward Thinking.